there's a quick Mentimeter poll that has super simple questions. It would be great for me to understand, where we all are at today as we explore the session. And in a little bit, we'll also see the responses here. So when we get a chance, I know some people are still coming in. We'll get started exactly at, in another minute, 3:06. If you have a chance, please go ahead and enter your response here. Yeah. And towards the end of the session, we'll take a look at this response and another one as well at the end of the session, and just get a sense for, how we're all feeling given the context of COVID, etc. Right? Okay. Why don't we get started? Hopefully we can still see. Okay. Hopefully we can all see my screen. Yeah. Super. I will start off by just doing sort of a super quick introduction about Sattva for those that are joining one of our sessions for the first time. Sattva Live is a series of webinars that we've been hosting really since the lockdown started around COVID. So we've had 3 or 4 sessions so far. Actually 3 Sattva Live sessions and other ecosystem engagements as well. And our purpose with these discussions is just to enable the dialogue, right? We think these are important topics for us to consider as social sector actors. And, we think we learn from hearing from you, and hopefully there is some insights that we can provide as well through these sessions, right? So today's topic, as you're aware, is we're thinking about tech for good, which is a topic that Sattva's been talking about and investing in for a while. And I know lots of folks in the ecosystem have as well. And what we want to explore is, our world literally shifted in the last month and a half, right? There has been significant disruption to what normal quote unquote means. And what does tech for good now mean in this context, right? Also, another thing to think about is a lot of us are problem solvers, right? A lot of us want to figure out how can we contribute to the solution? How can we make this better? And so hopefully this is also a dialogue that will have us thinking about some of those ideas. And we're certainly happy to share any context that we have from our ecosystem conversations. And hopefully that's what we'll build on at the end of this session as well, right? So just a little bit of context on the work we do. We are an organization that's, that's very firmly in the middle of the ecosystem. We work with entities across all different functional areas, right, from corporations to foundation funders. We also work with an incredible amount of social organizations and multilaterals and government agencies. And we really work across the spectrum of, SDG problems as well. And in terms of the work that we actually do, we focus on a few streams of work. There is a lot of primary research and insights that we work on our commission to do and share with the ecosystem. There is a lot of advisory services that we do across all of the actors that I just outlined earlier. We do a lot of program management, both for foundations as well as for corporates. And of course, there is also a lot of work we do in terms of understanding the impact of, social organizations, right? Now, what we've also done, and where this gets a little interesting in the tech for good context, is we've also been making a few different investments in some products around technology. So India Data Insights is our data platform for very actionable insights focused on the social sector. Shift is a platform that we've built out that focuses on, CSR program management, so kind of marries this. And Careers and Impact is another, part of our work where we look at placing, organizations with the right talent, right? And so this kind of comprises the spectrum of the work that we do. Before we get in here, I realized I didn't have a slide to introduce myself. So my name is Parvathy. I've been with Sattva for about 18 months now, I think. Yeah, about 18 months now. And my background is in the for-profit sector, in technology. Most of it is in the US. That was actually my first Indian employer. And I've been in the social ecosystem as well, as I said, for about 18 months, right? And my focus coming into this organization and coming into the sector was around technology for good, right? So that's really the problem space that I'm really focused on trying to solve for the impact sector. And so any inputs, any guidance anyone has, I would love to, connect offline as well and talk through that. Yeah. Okay, great. So I hate this slide, right? The numbers here are stark, and I just wish we didn't have to look at metrics like this, right? We're talking about 1,007 deaths in India today, right? And we're talking about every, at a per lakh population, we have confirmed 2 cases. And 40% of those are in Maharashtra. I grew up in Bombay. These are just, stark, horrifying numbers of the reality that we all live in today. This is where we are. This is what we're dealing with. This is why we are all trying to do this, from our homes. And I think what we are all trying to focus on to understand is, given that COVID-19 is the game changer that it is, right? What we are also seeing is that there is a great expectation that it will fundamentally impact the most vulnerable parts of our population, right? So informal economy workers, folks who are already dealing with poverty, right? Women and children and people who are more vulnerable. And study after study shows, in times of economic crisis, they are, susceptible to more violence, etc. Right? So what we're talking about now is a pandemic of proportions that we've not seen, right? In the past, the disasters we've seen have been contextualized within a particular geography, within a particular population segment. This is hitting everyone everywhere constantly, and the numbers are just getting starker and starker. And the second part here to think about is that this is also affecting people who are already struggling, right? So the scale of the problem, the pace at which it's growing, all of that is just really rapid and really requires all of our thinking and problem solving at its sharpest, right? So what we've been doing in Sattva is we've kind of broken out a whole stream of team members have just broken out to work on COVID. This is our largest priority today, right? And across the entire organization, different units of people are trying our best to address this problem from every angle we can. So one aspect of this is, we've kind of broken out internally into 4 tracks, and that's more in terms of the type of work that we're doing and the stakeholders that we're talking to. So one aspect of this is a track that we call Engage, right? Engage essentially looks at how do we inform the ecosystem about what's happening around COVID-19 so that so that it can drive tangible outcomes, right? That's kind of the first track. And as I mentioned earlier, we have been periodically sharing, information across all of our COVID work through these Sattva Live webinars. Today's track is really focused on what we do as part of the Engage initiative. The second track that we work on is Orchestrate. Orchestrate is where we kind of get our feet on the ground and get our hands dirty and do the work, which is we say, we're looking to marry resources that are desperately needed in our communities with suppliers who can get them to them, and with funders who are able to, fund a certain geography, provide them with, say, medical supplies, provide them with food, nutrition, whatever it is, right? And that entire, matching of who needs what, where, when, what is the funding required, what is the red tape that we have to overcome, what permissions, all of that stuff, logistics, e-passes, whatever it is, right? All of that is really held together today by the folks on the Orchestrate team. We also have another track called Build, and Build focuses on taking a slight step back, right? And Build is focusing a little bit on saying, what are systemic patterns we're seeing in these problems, right? So while your relief work is extremely, extremely important and critical today, should we be looking at a whole set of solutions that starts from, so for example, one of the problems that Build is looking at is saying, what happens when you've exhausted a certain amount of relief supplies and people are still not able to come back, the migrants are still not able to come back to the cities that were driving their economies, right? Do we need local level, market access? Do we need, commercial activity or localized markets and localized, solutions to be built out there, right? Similarly, what do we do with, women collectives, right? How do we make sure that women have economic, access to economic, markets as well? And so some of these larger questions around, how do we solve for migrant populations? How do we solve for women? Those types of conversations are also a very important point, which is even during the crisis right now. What happens to maternal health? What happens to early childhood health, right? What happens in the first 100 days, which are so critical? How do we make sure those types of services are also taken care of? So the build track kind of looks at those systemic types of problem solving and structuring and integrating that with different stakeholders. And finally, we have our enable track. Enable track really works very closely with our nonprofit partners. So we engage with them to really understand, how they are responding to COVID, what support they need. Also help them think through what is a short-term strategy for you, what's a long-term strategy for you, what did you set out to do this year, and what do you need to, what are risks that you need to mitigate, what are current strategy changes that you need to make, what adaptations do you need to make for COVID in your current communities, and perhaps is there a longer-term impact on COVID on your organization strategy, right? So thinking through that is something that our enable track does. And as I mentioned, we keep literally every week, right? As we learn more from our engagements in the ecosystem, we keep sharing this information. So, please contact us at any point if there are any questions about any of these, units of work. More than happy to share the insights from here. Okay, I'll jump into specifically the work that we've been doing under the Engage track, right? So we've been working on a few different approaches here. One is we've just been building out our information hub. So as much of external data as we can find, we've been trying to comb through, analyze it, and share it with the ecosystem. There's a series of, and I'll share that with you in a bit, there's a series of public goods dashboards that we've just created around COVID. And the idea and focus behind all of these is just, can we make it actionable? So someone can look at this information, make a decision, whether it's a government entity, whether it's a CSR organization, whoever it is, just anything we understand about the ecosystem, we immediately try and publish it. Another thing that we're also trying to do on the back end is we're also saying, can we now actually collate these data sets and identify some level of understanding of what is the risk and vulnerability at a district level, in different parts of the country, just to sharpen our responses, right? Because a lot of what we're doing now under the relief, right, and immediate handling of COVID work has to do with resource optimization. There is only so much to go around. It has to be super sharp. It has to go to the right people. There's no time, there's no real time or resources that we can spare, right? So trying to make decisions around those resources and trying to make them as sharp as possible is what we're trying to do with the second track. And finally, we're also looking at, rapid assessments and research, right? So we're all in a situation now, I'm sure all of us are home, and unable to reach out to the communities that we're trying to serve, right? Some of us are in those communities, but still not able to go out. And so in this kind of a situation, how do we truly understand what it is that the beneficiary needs today, right? Am I sending you thousands of bottles of sanitizers and you actually need food rations, right? Or do we need clothing? Are the women getting menstrual hygiene products, right? So there's just so many different types of needs that a particular community may have, right? Are they facing certain types of challenges because of the part of the space they live in, or other constraints that they have, right? Perhaps they're disabled, they can't access where you're giving supplies. So until you talk to the community, you will not fundamentally understand what it is that they need, and you will be solving the wrong problem. So that's another thing that we're trying to do with our Engage track, is to say, how can we keep this pipeline of direct conversation with our beneficiaries, direct conversation with our communities going, and do this in a very rapid, lightweight manner, so that you get the insights you get. You're very sharp with the questions you're asking. You realize that it's a very valuable resource to get time with those people. And you're also able to make really strong calculated decisions on what now to do with this primary information that you've gathered. So that's sort of the third track of work that we've been doing. On the first track that I was just mentioning, which is the Central Knowledge Hub, I'll just walk through some of the assets that we've already published. Please reach out to us with any further questions you may have. So one is we collected, about 3 weeks ago, there was just this barrage of information about COVID-19 that came. We didn't know what to, there was no structure to this. There was a bunch of announcements about people saying they were going to fund, COVID relief efforts. There was no way to structure and understand what does funding mean for you. Are you fundraising? Are you actually committing money to this? There was also a lot of requests for resources, right? And we had no idea if anybody was actually providing those resources, or it was the NGO on the ground not able to source this. Also, we saw a lot of information that was, we also saw, sorry, it looks like a gentleman was not able to listen in. Okay, I'll just go back. Hopefully he's able to rejoin. Yeah, so there's also a lot of, information out there that came in from global funders that we were not, that was also adding to the, kind of noise in the ecosystem. And so we just started about 3 weeks ago collating all of these news and announcement type informations. We have about 600 India specific ones and more that are global. And we've been trying to collate it so that there is a way for us to look at this information, get a high level India picture of where is the funding coming from, who's announcing it, have they already identified a partner to, donate to or to work with, or, essentially where is this being sent, right? Similarly, on the resources side, do we have a sense for which geography needs what supplies, and what on the supply side, what CSRs or other organizations have committed to certain resources, right? So that matchmaking, that insights are fairly clear and available here. In addition, we also, I hope everyone's able to see my screen now. Yeah, it's taking a little bit of time on my end to with the lag. Okay, in addition, we also looked at a lot of COVID relevant information. So we tried to look at healthcare in India in general, right? As I mentioned earlier, we have already an asset called India Data Insights, and we were able to pull a lot more, secondary data that gave you a picture of the health, the existing health infrastructure and existing health conditions of the communities at a district level. And then we layered in there COVID data as well to say, okay, within Maharashtra, what is the district that you really need to focus on, right? Within Bengal, what is the district you really need to focus on? Because it has these other underlying health, health infrastructure and health pre-existing condition challenges that are difficult. We've also started working on like an India vulnerability map. You'll see that we started off at a state level picture and have now been able to evolve it into a district level view. And it's looking at, as I said, a lot of factors such as what is the existing infrastructure from a health and a non-health perspective in that community? What is the composition of the community, right, in terms of demographics? Also looking at, what is the health condition of people there? And then what we've also done is to look at where do we have existing funding, right? So certain districts, for example, may already have a CSR funder who's almost adopted that district as part of their as part of their work with Niti Aayog for the aspirational districts, right? In that kind of a situation where you have an existing funder who already understands the district well, and you also have this risk profile of the district, your COVID related efforts will be much sharper because you're also able to now, take this information to your decision making, work with local partners, really focus on what needs to be done right, and build from there, right? So this is another part of the work that we've been, trying to take on. So what I'll do now is I'll actually dive a little bit into the first set of information that I talked about, which was here, right? Which says what are the India specific announcements that we've seen. What we did was we analyzed those and we also parsed out the information that is specific to technology, right? So as I mentioned, we have about 600 India specific COVID announcements. This includes things like I need ration, right? Or I'm raising funds for this community. What we did was we also then culled them to say how many of these are related to technology in some way, right? And for this discussion, the way we've broken our technology is, given that we are facing a healthcare crisis first, instead of just looking at sort of Hi, was there a question? Okay. Can someone on the chat, can one of the organizers please let me know if you're able to hear me okay, if I need to pause for any reason?
Parvathy, no, you're fine. You can
Great. Okay. Thank you. Cool. So we parse them out to say, how many of these are actually related to technology in some way. And we also looked at certain aspects of healthcare to try and include that. Because a lot of our innovation today is happening around, disease management, disease diagnostics, equipment, etc. And so try to pull those also into our responses. And when you look at it from that perspective, I was expecting lower numbers for a technology focus, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see that over 50% of the announcements that we've seen, and again, these are secondary news related announcements, over 50% of them have a technology focus, right? So that was really interesting to see that it's been a very integral part of our response in India. We also zoomed in a little bit to say, okay, now who is doing what, right? And, despite a lot of, I guess, preconceived notions around government and technology, our government's actually been extremely swift with adopting technology systems in their response. And I apologize to anybody that's got a healthcare background. I realize it's COVID-19, not COVID. But anyway, so our governments have actually been extremely swift to adopt technology in their responses. We see them do that a lot in terms of communicating with us, right? So almost, I mean, there's of course the MyGov portal that has a lot of information about COVID. You will find all the, the publications up there, all of the statistics on, COVID-19 and the situation in India up there. Every state has its own response and communication portal. And this has almost become like a no-brainer, and they're all extremely sophisticated. For example, if you see the BMC ones in Bombay, very strong, very sophisticated. So it's been very interesting to see that government adoption and mobilization of technology has been very strong. And we're seeing it kind of in three spaces, as I said. One is it's around, I'm sorry, there's something wrong with my screen. Okay, is this visible? Sorry, I don't know what's going on with the. Got it. Okay. Okay, is this visible now? Maybe I'm the only one who had a problem with this. Okay, super. Thank you. Yeah. So on the so we've kind of seen three, across our responses that we analyzed, we saw three big trends, right? One is that we saw that government was using these websites as a mean of communicating with their people. So whether it's at a central level, a state level, or even at a local level within a city, very strong, robust systems that analyze the data at a local level, give you a lot of opportunities to interact with, relief mechanisms, and have really interesting. For example, BMC, as I was mentioning earlier, has really interesting GIS-enabled, solutions as well in there, right? So quite robust and quite involved here. The second thing, of course, with Arogya Setu, it's become quite a game changer. So we've also seen that the government has invested in these disease tracking and management apps, and it's not just the central government who's done that with Arogya Setu. We've also seen that in some state governments like Uttarakhand, Gujarat, etc., have also their own disease management tracing apps. So this essentially is, based on your location, how close are you to somebody who could be infected with COVID, and how safe is it, for example, for you to go into work, right? Arogya Setu had two earlier prototypes. The one was called Corona Kavach and then Covin. They've both been replaced by this. It's got about 75 million downloads. And what's interesting now is that central government employees are now mandated to download it. and use that to make decisions about going back to work. So that's quite interesting to see that that's an approach that we've taken. The third thing where we are seeing government leverage technology is that during lockdown, how do you enable as much of work as possible to happen, right? So for example, there's pretty much every state has e-passes that let you travel across there, and so they've adopted solutions that essentially say that, okay, here is lockdown, but there's certain technology that will enable you to get access and go about as normally as you can, you're right, in terms of business. There's also, for example, certain states have sections where you can go ahead and upload information like you're a registered business, so that people know where they can get essential supplies, things like that. Yeah. So many, so the point I think to make here, one is that the government has been extremely robust and backed technology very strongly in its response to COVID-19. The second thing is the quality of these these portals and tools is quite strong, right? There are very there are quite sophisticated technologies that are in place here that have been deployed in these solutions. There's been a good amount of thinking and design that's gone into this. That's quite commendable. And it's actually quite heartening to see that we are leveraging everything that there is out there, or are to fight the disease and make sure that from a people support perspective, we're using everything we can there in terms of technology. Yeah. Okay, so that was on the government ecosystem perspective. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what are we seeing on the funder side, right? So what are we seeing as money going into fighting COVID-19? And we're actually, the macroeconomic crisis that we're facing is very real, very rapid. And just honestly, all the projections that we've seen out there are just not heartening at all, right? Despite that, what we are seeing is very, very active involvement from funders, including the government, to try and seek innovations to solve for COVID, right? And these are innovations in India. So it's not like we're waiting for, solutions to be built elsewhere in the world and then be imported into India. We're actually trying to build these for ourselves as well, given our current context. So that's also been a very heartening kind of, thing to see, because a lot of these thank you. Because a lot of these funders themselves are, in the same macroeconomic situation that we are, right? But I think what this now conveys to us is the urgency with which COVID-19 needs to be addressed before we can address any of the larger systemic issues. So from the government standpoint, what's interesting is, there's a very strong Make in India positioning in a lot of the work that's being done. There are, there's a very strong science focus, although there are opportunities for other types of innovation as well, around collaboration, around working remotely, etc. But what we are seeing a lot of is that a lot of the academic and science institutions are very actively engaged in the screening of potential innovations. There is funding as well. So depending on the size of the proposal that's submitted and how far it goes, the numbers vary depending on the type of solution that's offered. And it's at different stages, right? So this goes from, when you have a product concept all the way to looking for scale, there are opportunities for seeking government funding. One challenge that's come in that there's been a lot of flack about is the fact that, the definition criteria for a startup in terms of what sort of the financial benchmarks that they need to meet is kind of a little bit unrealistic, right? And so that, I think that's created some hesitancy with some of the innovators because it feels too limiting. And so we haven't, that's just one feedback kind of from the ecosystem that we are observing and hearing. Another area that we are seeing is collaboratives, which is also very interesting. So we're seeing a lot of funding from multiple actors working together, right? These could be folks that are that play different roles in the ecosystem. So these could be people that are, say, corporates working with foundations, working with a government entity, working with startups, and then all of them together pooling in the funding to identify an innovation to solve a particular problem, right? The marquee, and here again, the solution can range from something that's in a seed stage, early ideation stage, all the way to something that needs an accelerator for scale. And the marquee kind of investment here is ACT grants at the 100 crore, which is very much driven by a lot of the people in the startup ecosystem working very closely with NGO partners. So there's a lot of opportunity here as well to look at. And then finally, we also have philanthropy organizations, so organizations which are traditionally funders in the social impact space, of which Umidyar, for example, has released a very large grant, right? Similarly, AVPN has talked about a very large commitment from a lot of its member organizations. And what's interesting is Give India, which is traditionally a fundraising platform, has also been able to create a fund that it's using to distribute within the ecosystem, right? So that's also been a very interesting model to observe. And the point here being that there are a lot of people who are really focused on solving for this problem and putting in investments behind a good idea. Right, and a lot of these investments tend to be around technology innovation. So that's kind of the big thing to keep in mind. Another thing is it's also extremely interesting to see how many of the there's a bunch of hackathons, bunch of innovation grants, challenges, etc., also constantly happening, and it's been extremely interesting to see how much of a play data science and informatics related funding is cutting across what you have around healthcare, livelihood, etc. Just that play of understanding and analyzing and being really sharp and intelligent about data sciences and really advanced modeling techniques as well is definitely getting a lot of traction and cutting across all kinds of funders. Yeah. I wanted to pause here and see if anyone has had a chance to complete the Menti. And Alisha, Ankit, would you be able to show if it's come through? Can you show what the results were from the first set of questions we'd asked? I can stop presenting if that helps.
I think you have the answers.
Got it, yeah. So thank you everyone for responding, right? So it looks like for the most part, we're optimistic about technology in the COVID-19 context, which is brilliant. And I don't know if I needed a not sure and confused, but somewhere between not sure and confused is a good bunch. And we have some folks who are feeling anxious about technology as well. So this also came through in some of the questions that you had very kindly asked before the session. Let's see if we can address more of this and see how we feel at the end of the session as well. So thank you for projecting this. I'm going to switch back to my PowerPoint show. Please bear with me if it's a little slow. Okay, super. All right. What we also saw was, we also dug a little bit into how are civil society organizations looking at technology, and how is it impacting the work they do now during COVID. One thing that is for sure is the role that fundraising platforms play, right? So whether it's fundraising platforms, digital wallets, UPI, all of that, just the level of leveraging digital transactions and platforms, fundraising platforms that CSOs have been able to do around COVID is, the volumes are just unprecedented, both in terms of amounts raised, etc. Right? There is also what I think used to be called the PM Relief Fund, which is now called PM Cares. This has also come in and become one of the largest, retail fundraising initiatives, and that came in quite strongly in our data as well. What we're seeing is also that a lot of organizations are very effectively using data and technology in their solution delivery space itself, right? So, for example, we're able to see that, oh gosh, it's doing that thing again. Yeah. Okay. So we're seeing that there is, okay, so we're seeing that there is a lot of leveraging technology in the work that the organizations do. So for example, Haktashak, had a lot of content in the past and has now launched an app I think last week or so, right? Gramvani has gone really deep in terms of the work it does around community radio. Lots and lots of our partners are really looking at how do we connect with our community using something like a WhatsApp. Right? And so in terms of looking at technology for driving awareness and engagement within our communities, there's a lot of information that's happening in this manner, right? We're also seeing that perhaps the drones, etc., may not be part of what CSOs specifically are doing, but we are seeing that tools like that are also being developed or used as resources for things like mapping, for example, on Google Maps, right? Now you have a mapping that tells you where shelters are or tells you where food packets are being distributed. So even in the work that people are trying to do on the ground, we're seeing increasingly technology being leveraged, and so social media technology, etc. Another thing that I wanted to dive a little bit into, because most of the questions that came in prior to the session today were related to education, is we also took a look at kind of how how is education, how are education related NGOs. Education is also sort of the largest funded focus area, thematic area in the CSR space. And so we were also wondering, how do education related NGOs deal with the fact that schools closed early, right? How do they engage with their communities? And we found that there's been a lot of so first, a lot of the content that had already been built out for teacher training, for student training, etc., wherever possible, our partners are either reaching out to their communities through the channels that I first mentioned, or they are trying to see if they can at least connect with the teachers and conduct trainings with them, etc., using content that's already digitized and available online. Yeah. Another thing that is really interesting and goes back kind of to the innovation conversation we were having earlier is, we also looked at just what is the response for even a hackathon that's not paid, right? So this isn't a funder coming in that saying that I have grant money for you. This is somebody saying, hey, I have these 3 COVID problems for you. Do you want to help us figure it out? Even for those types of hackathons, over 500 entries typically get submitted. Right? That's sort of the average response rate. So just in terms of the number of community, CSO organizations, including volunteer groups, including people that have technology, etc., expertise, coming in to try and solve for this, it's been extremely heartening. One more thing we dove a little bit into was to say, how does the technology industry, what are we seeing in terms of responses, across the IT, ITES, industry? And we kind of broke it out into sort of 3 areas, right? We said, okay, there are technology product companies, and this is also driven by how we saw the responses. So we saw technology product companies, we saw a lot of the ITES companies, and we saw, e-commerce and gig economy players, and the responses were all slightly different. So I just want to dive into that a little bit. What we've seen with the technology product companies is that actually with all of them, there definitely were corporate CSR donations, right, towards COVID initiatives, or also going deeper with the partners that they already have in place, right, and funding them. Another thing that we saw, so that was common across all 3. With technology product companies, we're also seeing some free resources being available around COVID. So there's a lot of content level resources that are available. There's a lot of data sciences resources. There are sort of training webinars and certifications and events, for example, that would have been extremely difficult to attend otherwise, that are all being live streamed, or they're trying their best to make sure that these are all things that people can access. We're also seeing very advanced tech collaborations. I know IBM is doing a ton of work around that. Google and Apple have had a collaboration. Lenovo has done a very interesting, you know, deep work around advanced technology, around supercomputing. And so it's also a little bit of sort of going deep with technology solutions at a product company level that they've engaged in. What was also interesting for me was to see that something like the Paytm COVID-19 insurance also came through, right? So a lot of the announcements that I'd kind of gone through earlier were related to you know international companies, etc. But Paytm, for example, has partnered with the Reliance to come up with a product called a COVID-19 insurance, which is very valid. It's a medical insurance product at this point. But it was also interesting to see how that was a response as well. Like there is an opportunity around COVID as well that some organizations are able to pick up on. The ITES companies, a lot of them are B2B, and we've primarily seen their effort focused around, CSR donations and corporate foundation donations, all very sizable. But that seems to be the direction that we're seeing for the most part. With e-commerce companies and with gig economy companies, right? So these are companies that have relied a lot on perhaps daily wage earners, right? Like the Uber drivers, or have relied on people, a migrant population that's left. What we are seeing is one, of course, the CSR donation part works. We're also seeing that there is a lot of relief initiatives that they are focused on, and they conduct fundraisers for, like Zomato has done one, I think Swiggy has also done one, that essentially says, can we give money back to these folks that were working in our organizations? And they're doing this as usually as corporate matching fundraisers, right? Another thing that we're also seeing is that we're also seeing some innovation around COVID, that these organizations are leveraging their existing capability to convert that for COVID, right? So for example, Uber's got a program where they are providing transportation for essential response workers, right? Medical workers. Similarly, Swiggy's got community kitchens that it's got in place, and they work fairly closely to see where can you use our skills and can we help you somewhere, right? That's kind of the pattern that we've seen here. All of them, sorry. This is going to drive me nuts. Okay. Hopefully you're all still able to follow along. So all of them are working or trying to work as closely as they can with either NGO relief efforts or government efforts, right? So I know Swiggy, for example, came up with a tracing app to assess, where folks need food, right, for the Karnataka government. And so they're trying their best to say, we have these assets, we have this talent pool, anywhere we can help, we'll try and do that. Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So just taking sort of a step back, that was kind of just an overview of what we've seen in our data in terms of response to COVID, particularly from a technology framework. Just taking a step back, what we at Sattva kind of see happening, and I know everybody is having that conversation as well today, is that there's really a short, medium, and a long-term phase to this, right? The short-term phase is around relief and rehabilitation. So we have to contain this disease, right? We have to get to a point where we're not sort of, in lockdown mode anymore. We have to be able to make sure that vulnerable communities are getting food, supply, money, whatever it is, like right now, right? So there's a whole short-term focus which will happen until we figure out how to get to a somewhat normal situation with COVID, and that's need of the hour solutions, right? This 3 to 12 months is completely, this is just a very high level estimate. We're not sure if this is the timeline, but we're also thinking that there is a medium term point where we'll have to figure out how do we get us back to work, right? There is only a certain point up to which relief can play out. How do we make sure that there are different supply chain and logistics solutions for different industries when we are so interconnected, and migrant workers are such an integral part of our economy? How do we make sure that larger, construction, manufacturing, those types of, physically in one place, large teams kind of industries are able to kind of get their workers back somewhat safely? how do we look at our small and medium entrepreneurs, right? That's the backbone of our economy. How do we make sure that those sectors are somewhat taken care of, and we have a way to strengthen them? And of course, livelihood of individuals, right? So everyone who's migrated, not all of them are going to be able to make it back to the Delhi or Bombay or wherever they were making their income. What are there opportunities for something locally that can still give them a livelihood, right? And there's a saying, never let a I think catastrophe go to waste. So in this terrible situation, pandemic that we see ourselves in, there's also opportunity. So at a later point, we definitely see us saying, can we look at some longer term structural solutions, such as health infrastructure in our country, right? Safe working conditions for some of our workers, right? Looking at education, next phase, because clearly now, despite all the investments in online learning, there are many ways in which it's come short, right? So there's many opportunities also for us to think about, which we see as our reimagine and reform phase. And that, this is kind of the timeline in which we're seeing work happen. Now, when you look at technology in the context of all of this, and we look at sort of what are fundamentally things that we could do better in all the technology response that we just walked through now, the two areas really stand out, right? One area that stands out is, like everything else, most of our focus has been on the relief side. There are certainly ideas happening now in return and reform, but they are very nascent, right? Most of the effort today is on relief, and it could be much more effective than it is now, right? So there are we're hitting a certain level of efficiency and effectiveness, and we really have an opportunity to improve on that. And the second thing is return and reimagine. Absolutely, this is the point for us to start designing some of those programs, thinking about how we integrate, and plan for deploying them. So these are sort of coming through as the two big themes in which technology could improve on our end. Yeah. So I just want to look at relief for a little bit, and go back to this point we made, which is saying, we can make relief more effective. I don't know if you guys have toddlers or have seen toddlers play football. Another analogy that some folks in our organization use is the Lagan cricket team, right? So everybody goes to the ball together. So when I looked at the 340 or so technology related announcements that we analyzed, a good 15% of them were literally case trackers of which the WHO publishes, which the Ministry of the Indian government publishes. And so what we were also I was definitely seeing a lot of waste there, because I did comb through all of them individually. And that's a little challenging, right? At this particular point, where we're talking about speed to market with some of these solutions, when we're talking about the real problems, the real relief efforts not reaching communities, some of the innovations it felt were definitely redundant, right? And so how can we do better? Because I don't think anybody starts off saying, let me build out something that's redundant. But I think what may be helpful is for us to say, what really are real problems to solve for relief, who's not solving them, and where can we focus, right? So some of the focused thinking may help us drive better ideas and innovation around relief itself. So if you remember, we had listed a few kind of sample relief problem areas. And we are seeing that there's a lot of effort, thanks to all of the collaboratives and funding, around testing for COVID, contact tracing as well. We already talked about that earlier. And provision of PPE kit. A lot of this is, human and on the ground type of problem solving, but a lot of this can also be better enabled by technology. And we're seeing some initiatives and effort there. And the last one, which is, where you're trying to make sure that the most impacted and vulnerable people get the relief resources they need, we find that to be a long space for innovation. Hi, is somebody not on mute? Could you please go on mute? Thank you, appreciate it. Okay, so we do see that as a large white space, right? And that's because while there are data points that say who is announcing what resource, while there are NGOs asking for resources. A lot of the connectivity points, like exactly where is it needed. In fact, one of the questions that was asked before the webinar session as well was around exactly this, saying that we have so much wastage in the food relief supply, and how do we circumvent that? So those types of problems are still not very sharply addressed, right? And so it could use some thinking around that. And even if we are creating these information aggregators and data dashboards, if we could pivot our attention to say what is the problem we can solve here, I think there could be a lot of value from those types of solutions. Yeah. And so how do we approach now building for relief, or building technology in COVID, or building technology? I think we should say building technology particularly in COVID, right? So if we are saying that all these efforts around relief solutions didn't work, right? Can we look at some principles or some ways for us to think about our our initiatives and our technology building in a way that we're not duplicating, we're constantly adding value to the ecosystem, and the solutions we build are truly meaningful, right? Couple of things to think about. One is, this is an internal framework within Sattva that we use to discuss poverty, right? And we talk about, the first principle that I kind of want to leave you guys with as you're thinking about what technology solutions to build on, is it is extremely critical for us to have fundamental, very clear understanding of our beneficiaries, right? The way poverty and vulnerable communities, kind of manifest themselves, we look at them in terms of, are you able to participate? Do you have strong ability to participate? Do you have access to resources and services? Do you have the ability to exercise fundamental rights? Are you resilient when there is when there is a pandemic like COVID, right? And so these are the ways in which manifestation, in which poverty is manifested. But what are the underlying issues, right? These all tend to be underlying issues. So my gender could affect what I can access. My geography, where I live, could affect what I access, because I may not have the infrastructure, right? The point we were making about the districts at risk. Similarly, physical or mental disabilities could be a challenge, and so on, right? So these are all the underlying issues under the iceberg, and on top of the iceberg, you just say that this is a vulnerable community and a beneficiary, right? Quote unquote beneficiary, which is a very problematic term in and of itself. So if this is all that goes into identifying, or any combination of this could be what makes your community vulnerable. How do we understand that in advance of making tech? Right? So, for example, if you're looking at saying that I want to solve for people being aware of what to do around COVID, right? If I want to solve for communication mechanism, emergency communication mechanism among people, in vulnerable communities around COVID, what we need to understand is that perhaps they only communicate in their local language, and perhaps they can't read or write, right? Maybe smartphone access is a complete privilege for them, right? And maybe they're making a choice between buying a data plan and buying, food for that week, right? Maybe technology itself is scary, right? Unless somebody I trust shows me my way around the app, it's not going to work. These are very real situations. These are very real considerations for us when we build out, these products and apps. Uh, and unless we fundamentally understand it in a very empathetic way, what we build will not, solve for the problem that we're looking to solve for, which is, say, disease awareness, right? This should not come as a surprise to us afterwards. And by the way, this is not just a rural India thing, right? This can happen in Bombay. This can happen in Delhi. There are pockets within every tier 1 city, all the way down to the most rural hamlet, where this exact same condition exists, and this is, what the communities you're trying to build for are facing. Another thing to think about is that, okay, so there's been all this government financial incentives that have been announced. Lack of access to even a bank to get my money, my 2,000 rupees, my 5,000 rupees, whatever the state or the central government has announced, is a real problem, right? I don't have access to the bank. I don't know how to get my money. I don't know what my Aadhaar number, like, I don't know how I get into the system to try and enable this. And a lot of these places have sign up deadlines of April 30th. That's today, right? Who was able to get in? Who knew that deadline? Who was able to get out there and avail of this? We don't really know, right? And then if you think about things like, physical safety or mental health, right? Study after study shows you that um, in times of economic crisis and strife, violence increases, right? And domestic violence really increases. This affects women, this affects children, this affects their mental health, physical safety. You're already stuck in a house, and you're stuck in a house with somebody who's who's violent towards you, right? You're almost trapped with with the person that you feel least secure with. How do you deal with situations like that? So these are your, you know, these are your communities, these are your vulnerable communities, and they exist all across the country, right? Are we building for them? Do we understand them fundamentally to be able to build for them, right? So one thing I wanted to call out is, as we are looking at technology, it's extremely important for us to try and say, is there any information, real, trustworthy information I can understand about my community, even if it is minimally, right? Typically say I would do this kind of analysis with 1,000 people. Can I even talk to 10? Can I talk to 20, 150, whatever it is, right? But it's really, really, really important for us to understand what is happening with people on the ground, who they are, right? Understand what aspects of vulnerability our communities are dealing with, and only then say what is the solution I should build, right? So that's extremely critical to try and do. One area where technology can really play a role is with enabling us to collect this information in a light manner, in a very scalable manner, and still get meaningful insights, right? Um, and there are a lot of platforms that can help you understand this. So one is, how do I collect this information? And two is, when I have now decided to fund and manage a program for a particular community, how do I make sure that I understand exactly what we are trying to build out? So there are this is definitely an area where we highly recommend some level of investment, because unless you have a plan for what you want to do with the community and how you want to help them, and unless you figure out what their needs were and then how you measure if what they needed got to them, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to try and maximize your impact there. So the first principle really was, you have to try and understand your audience. You really have to try and understand your communities extremely well. The second principle is around collaboration, right? And particularly now, it's extremely important that we build on resources and talent from each other, versus trying to figure out how we invent from scratch, right? So one is, there are enough open source and other tools in place where we can really try and do this very effectively. I think I want to start with the macroeconomic part, which is to say that economic conditions are going to be very, very tight, or as far as we can see over the next 18 months, 24 months. You're going to be dealing with limited funding, right? And limited funding essentially means that you have to prioritize where resources go. So in this kind of a scenario, the trying to optimize the resources, trying to build for impact, and trying to build solutions that will go the distance is extremely important to do. The second thing is, we're in a very interesting space, right? There's this, I'm not sure if it's an African proverb or a quote that's been attributed to being an African proverb, but I like this quote, right? It essentially says that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. We're faced with a pandemic, which means you have to go far and fast, right? So how do you make sure that you're making quick decisions, you're making them, you're failing fast, you're able to pivot very quickly, and when you're ready for scale, there is somebody that you can take along with you, right? And so this is extremely important for us to try and figure out. And again, it goes back to understanding who you're building for and what they actually face. Only then will your solution really stick, right? Your tech solution. And the final part of it is around complementing, diverse skills that everybody brings to the table. So it's very important for us to work together, right? And one of the reasons it's important to work together is because so many problems have already been figured out. Why would we start trying to solve for, I don't know, drone technology, when there are 50 other organizations that are saying, we want to support you on the COVID front with gathering data via drones, right? So, and the other aspect of it is also, the government is doing its best to try and keep people safe, and protected during this pandemic. But there are a lot of gaps between a scheme that's announced and how it gets delivered on the ground. There are just so many opportunities for us to innovate there, and even picking some of them apart, right? Like, so financial distribution, how do we go about it? And saying genuinely nobody is looking at solving for this. Can we hone in on that and try and figure out how to approach it? Who else is working in this, in the ecosystem on this problem? How can we collaborate? What is the, instead of starting with, I have AI, what should I do? If we start with, here is a big problem to solve where I can actually use AI, that would be a much stronger approach. Yeah. So that's kind of the two principles that I want to leave you with. One is really fundamentally understand your beneficiary. Please, even if it's in a light manner, please make sure that you understand what that community needs. And two is do look at everyone you can collaborate with, right? If you are traditionally doing one thing, this is the time for us to also look at what, how else can I leverage what I already do? I have content in a certain form. Can I leverage that for something else? Yeah. Now, yeah, and I'm just reiterating the point that we had made around return and reimagine, which is to say that there are actually these medium-term and long-term problems, just a sample of them here, that we can actually solve for in a very specific way. It'll be great to start now to think about your approach here. Yeah. Are there any questions that anybody would like to ask me on chat? Please do. Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and just kind of talk through some very, very great. So e-learning platforms, is there a question around that? Did you just ask what did I say about them? Okay, so let me pick up. So I had about 6 or 7 questions related to education. If I can just pick up that question around e-learning platforms along with them, I think it'll be very helpful. Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, so I want to just pick a couple of examples that highlight the 2 points that I was making earlier about collaboration and focus on beneficiary. And these are organizations that we worked with in different contexts, and so I'm happy to share whatever we know of them. What we're finding is super interesting is something like an Arman, right? I don't know if you know of them. They're an organization that focuses on maternal and child health. And during the COVID crisis, so they have a helpline, they help you through your entire pregnancy. There are SMS alerts that come in before all of that. There's a ton of really strong focus and insights that they've driven around saying, what does a mother need when she is in a vulnerable community and is pregnant, right? And what does the child need? How do we make sure that that pregnancy goes through well and the child has, strong early childhood outcomes? And they've really done such a great job now of being able to leverage their telemedicine tools for mothers who are not able to get to the hospital now due to lockdown, right? So they're able to address some of those questions, some of those emergency questions remotely, and they've been able to also direct them to the hospital when needed, right? As opposed to adding to that system or adding stress to somebody who needs to travel during lockdown. So I think the really interesting takeaway for me with them was how quickly the fact that they really fundamentally understood this problem space of vulnerable communities and maternal health there has really stood them in, and they had technology investments there, of course, but they were really able to scale it significantly in the kind of COVID situation that we're dealing with now, right? LTFS has this program called, or funds this program called Digital Sakhis, which is their flagship program. And we've helped them with this in a few different states. And these are essentially, women who are empowered as an intermediary to help you create, conduct digital finance transactions, right? So they're the experts. They have an app. They understand how to set up a bank account and help you access, digital finance assets. And a program like this has so much value because you now have a local community, a trusted community advisor, somebody who has digital access, and how do you leverage someone like that even in a different setting, like delivering relief, right? And so an ecosystem that's built around understanding that set of beneficiaries who didn't have access to digital finance is something that we can leverage for new technology solutions also as well that we are considering now, right? Another question that keeps coming up is how do we communicate, how do we communicate with our students? How do we communicate with our teams that are remote? How do we communicate with communities that when we want to explain to them, about COVID? And I wanted to call out a couple of things, right? A lot of the beneficiaries and communities we've talked to will not have access to the internet at all. If they have access to the internet and they have a smartphone, WhatsApp is a very key way for them to communicate. And very interestingly, which we were also surprised by, is that TikTok is actually a channel that's gaining a lot of traction among young people in India, right? So if you're looking to communicate with adolescents about something, that's definitely a channel to consider, assuming that they have internet access, etc. And what do you do in communities that don't, right? How do you say schools don't open in June? How do you look at sharing content with scores of children who don't have access to the internet? And what the work that Gramvani, for example, has done around community radio, right? Swayam Prabha, which is around using DTH channels for education, already has content sitting out there. These are partners to consider in terms of collaboration, right? I have content, I have a methodology of teaching. Can I use you as my channel to communicate? My people have access to WhatsApp. They use WhatsApp all day for all kinds of things. Can I convert my content to make it relevant in that channel? Right? These are all questions for us to ask ourselves, because no matter what tech we build out, it is going to be important to see how does at the end of the day, the beneficiary or the community actually access, right? I wanted to pick up on content and look at some ideas here as well, which is today we have a lot of education content. We have a lot of, for example, SEL content, which is so rich and robust, and perhaps we had anticipated sharing it in a certain manner, right? An in-person setting, a workshop, a classroom setting, etc. Some organizations have published this on their websites, for example, but it's a very difficult concept to, unless you're already understanding the space, right? I think it's, yeah. So some organizations have, for example, on their website, a daily SEL note, right? So life skills in the time of COVID kind of a conversation. And if you look at that content, is it possible for us to help figure out a different channel for sharing that content? Maybe a WhatsApp. Can we figure out how to share it in smaller pockets? Maybe video. Can we figure out how to repurpose it so that I can better deal with COVID, right? So those are all opportunities that exist that can perhaps be done with existing assets that we already have. And even, kind of more robust thinking in terms of saying, where are our people? Fundamentally, what do they need? And how do I now repurpose what I have or adapt what I'm doing in a more innovative manner is definitely something for us to explore as people who are looking at technology. Yeah. One last point I do want to bring up is vernacular content. A lot of content is available in about 10, 11 languages, which still will not reach a lot of the communities that we're looking to reach. So how we can scale out content, even if it is awareness around COVID, in more languages, etc., and how do we make sure that the information is authentic, is definitely a problem for us to try and track. There are many aggregators who have strong content. But how do we deploy it? How do we make sure that the community is reading it, is engaging in it, is understanding it, practicing it? All very important questions for us to try and solve. Yeah. I will jump to Q&A. I think we've only got 15 minutes. Okay. My apologies. I think I've gone a little deep. Okay. So these are all the questions that I received before our session. I have one more question regarding e-learning platforms, which I'll capture. If there are any additional questions, please do ask them on the chat box. I'll do my best to answer them. If not, some of the questions we can also just respond to after the session is over and make sure that you get it along with the deck. So one is, how do you make farmers see technology and gadgets as their guide and use it to seek knowledge? I think the guiding principle here is to, again, going back to understanding what these farmers need, right? In our work with farmers, particularly in a technology and AI setting, we've observed that technology can be intimidating. There are certain channels that they trust more than others. There are certain people they trust more than others. So being able to deploy technology, I mean, it's not just about building the tech and expecting them to use it. It's also understanding how they use it, how they use certain channels, and also who are intermediaries who can initially help them realize that this tech is trustworthy and not intimidating. Is Are all three things to solve for, in addition to saying, how can they use it to seek knowledge? It's a very important question to solve for. And you'll find this also in, for example, healthcare, right? It's not just agriculture. Even in healthcare, how do we make sure that some information that you share during COVID that comes on the phone is trusted and acted on by people, is something to you have to explore it in all these three dimensions. AI for social good. Yeah. So one question was, is there a play for AI for social good in India? Absolutely. So two things. One is the core principle I will keep going back to is, please don't look at AI as your as your North Star, right? I have to use AI to solve for tech should not be how we approach it. Ideally, we should be approaching it by saying, what is the problem space, right? What do we see in terms of relief? What do we see in terms of return and reform? Where I want to solve? Who do I want to solve it for? How do they work, right? And then step back to say, okay, where does AI really play a role here? Is what I would recommend. But I mean, what we were just talking about with in terms of vernacular content, extremely important to solve for, right? Can we, I don't know, leverage NLP better, more effectively? Right? Are there, yeah, so I think there's tons that we could do here. One immediate win definitely is in terms of content, in vernacular languages, for example. But how we, go about it, what problem space we pick and who we pick it for, super important to figure out first. Yeah. Impact of COVID on social development programs. I think I talked about it a little bit. And I would broadly say it in this manner. One is, it's a very difficult macroeconomic condition. Funding is going to be very careful, right? That being said, there is a lot of interest in solving for COVID, and lots of good ideas on the plate, and exploring more good ideas is absolutely something that we should try and do. But I don't know that, just a renewal of the work that we did the last year is going to be feasible now. We really have to say, how has my community evolved because of COVID, and what problem should I help solve, right? Okay, I think I've also talked about the focus on tech in terms of long-term economic implications, so that was already addressed. How do I take an on-field business to an online platform? Extremely complex. So two patterns or sort of insights that we have emerging here. One is, a lot of the offline work, we'll have to look at two options. One is there an opportunity to do less of it but go deeper, right? So like what I was talking about with the understanding a community's needs, we typically do those needs assessments on the field, right? Can we do that through partners who are already locally there? That could be one opportunity. And can we do it with fewer people, because it's difficult to reach many, right? So I think just looking at what was your on-field business, where is the value, and what part of that can you still do safely, is extremely important to figure out. The second thing to figure out is, now for the rest of it, right? How do I look at online options? While there are many open source, assets that you could potentially leverage, you still need skills and resources to be able to use them. So I think just putting a few of those things into consideration before figuring out a business model is very critical. How does the technology pay a favor? Sustainable financial models, yeah. Yeah. So there is, if you remember the return solutions, right? Return problems rather. What did we talk about there? We talked about the fact that we have to open up some pockets of economy soon. We have to figure out safe working conditions for manufacturers, construction workers, people who work in one place physically. We have to figure out how local economies can be built, right? All these can definitely be enabled by technology, right? Are there massive scalable detection technology that you can use? Are there massive sanitization, disinfection technology we could use? Are there more robust tracing applications? Many ways for us to look at, saying, can I look at COVID, focus on real problems that it little cost, and figure out a way to get the economy kind of a little bit back on track. I think if you focus on what the right questions are, there'll be real value from technology solutions here. Okay, IT services startup, helping social impact partners with technology solutions when their fund lines are drying up. Again, I think I'm going back to the same question. One is please collaborate, figure out what you're bringing to the table that's unique from somebody else's offering. Two is, really like look for that value. And two is fund lines are drying up, but fund lines are not drying up for real problems, real solutions for real problems, right? So the more you focus on the, more you focus on the analytics here, the better and stronger you can get, right? One more, okay. And then how do we handle group activities using technology? So this is really difficult because we're used to doing workshops. We're used to being in one location together. We're used to doing very immersive work that inspires all of us, in a physical setting in one place. Replicating that is going to be difficult. However, it's not about replicating this, right? It's about adjusting to what is our new reality and saying, how do we still build those types of immersive engagements? A couple of tips that have worked for us. We've struggled with this at Sattva ourselves, and we have some really strong people who've thought about this and come up with some very interesting ideas. I think we kind of try to bring the humanity back into our interactions whenever we can, even if it is just for like one catch up once a week. We have a lot of cross company open communication about the situation today, right? Both at a personal front and at a professional front. We also try and make sure that these interactions are a lot shorter, right? So we're no longer doing, 1 day long client workshops. We're doing 2 hours over 4 days, right? So I think those types of tips and tricks for handling group energy in a remote setting, using technology tools like a Zoom, like what we're using here with GoToMeeting, it have been effective, and I quite recommend. Mobilizing community for creating mass awareness through awareness to mass awareness. Yeah. Okay. So again, please understand where your community is and what they have access to. Right? Don't expect everything to be available on a digital platform. Don't expect that people can get onto YouTube when they want, or even WhatsApp when they want. One of the really interesting stories I heard was in an agricultural district with that community. What they used for talking about COVID was those big vehicles that you have during elections that announce with the loudspeaker on top, right? That was the right technology solution to use in that context. So think about your community, think about what channels they can use in a meaningful manner, and deploy those in that manner. Why is network fluctuating more? Because we're all online all the time. How can an organization leverage technology ensuring data privacy? Well, this is an extremely, extremely important question. Again, going back to some of our fundamentals, right? How do we make sure that key information is de-identified, particularly when we're dealing with healthcare related information, right? How do we make sure that a person's right to privacy, right to specific information about themselves is kept kept private, and measures are taken there. So I would say that thinking about this in the beginning rather than in the end is very important. So what level of again, going back to first principles, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? For which beneficiary? Then what level of data do I need about this beneficiary? I don't need their Aadhaar number, I don't need their name, I don't need their gender, I don't need their age. Don't collect it, right? Please work with just the levels of data that we need, and depending on the sensitivity of the data, please make sure that you're investing in the data privacy and security aspects. I can't think of one funder who would invest in COVID and not care about this, right? This is something that's very important from a philosophical perspective for all of us. And so please make sure that if this is not something you're funded for, you ask for it, but don't take this data lightly that we've been entrusted with. How do teachers? Got it. So I think this might have been two questions together, or I'm taking a bunch of education questions together, right? So one question is around many teachers around the world are using the internet to keep their students learning. During lockdown, my kids have a very different learning routine. How do I help them with that? Yeah, I think this is maybe another question I can take along with this is, can technology help our government school teachers reach in any way our internet deprived children? extremely important for us to solve for, right? So most of the districts that we work in, certainly all of our aspiration districts, a good chunk of our vulnerable communities do not have access to internet. Perhaps what they have access to is that, perhaps what they have access to is that you have, um, you have ways of downloading the information and sharing it with them. Or perhaps what they have access to is, TV channels. Perhaps what they have access to is radio, right? So understand what the right mechanics of integrating with that community are. What another thing that could potentially be also happening is, the physical books and distributing that in a safe manner. I think we have to really, particularly in education, now it's holidays, but in June, we don't know that the schools are reopening, right? So particularly in education, I think this is a very important pause for us to think about how do our communities, how can we engage with our communities? What are safe ways for us to physically interact with them and share some of this information? And what are ways in which we can adapt what we receive digitally, people with net access receive digitally, and share it with them in a physical manner, right? One thing I do want to call out about the children and their normal work schedule is, student learning is extremely important, but I think one thing for us to keep in mind and also to think about our planning of our calendar year is that, these children are home, and it's not the holidays, right? They're home and it's a pandemic. So there is a lot of mental stress and, emotional stress that they're also going through, and they're young and unable to express a lot of this. So whatever we do in terms of our typical education programs, I think we have, it's extremely important for us to also take this into consideration, and look at other types of engagement beyond the academic sort of, teaching the math and the language alone. Thinking about, certain life skills, thinking about ways of coping, thinking about additional content related to mental health will all be very, very critical, particularly in these, communities. Are we doing enough with technology in online education and primary healthcare? Is the answer, sorry, one more question was, what are the low cost technologies to cater education to children during COVID-19? As I said, to our surprise, from a recent study, we found TikTok was one of them. So, again, it goes back to understanding what they have access to. So whatever they have access to, and whatever exists as an infrastructure in that community, I would say start there, and then look at what can be built on later, right? There was another question around, are we doing enough with technology in online education, primary healthcare? I think online education, clearly not. If we've solved for all our content to be delivered only when you have internet access, and primary healthcare, I think both of these areas can do with more thinking, right? And maybe COVID is the melting point that's making us going to innovate here. Different ways in which social sector organizations are reaching out to privileged society. So, yeah, so this is very interesting because, I have 2 minutes. Okay, sorry. I think I'll have to actually take some of these questions offline. I apologize if I wasn't able to get to yours. There is one question also on the chat that said, out of the 340 tech-related solutions, can you give us any other insights like geographic spread, thematic spread, etc.? We're more than happy to. I'll make sure to share that along with the question and answers. Okay, so there are very good questions. And I'll make sure to come back with these answers a little bit offline. I appreciate you guys staying on for this long. I would love it if you could just do the Mentimeter again. I'd like to see how we're feeling about technology in general after the session, now that we've had a bit of a discussion around this. Could someone please share the link, or maybe I can, would it be the same code? Yeah, great. Thank you, Alicia. I'm going to try and present my screen here again so you can take a look at. What we need to do. So you just go to menti.com and then you enter this code, and that's all that's needed. Okay, while that's happening, and Alicia, if I could just request you in a couple of minutes or so to share that again, so we understand how we're doing. I just wanted to quickly wrap up with saying thank you for for your time and for joining. I'm sorry we were not able to complete a lot of the questions. They were really interesting ones, and I really appreciate you guys asking them in advance. Any information you'd like as an add-on to this, you will be receiving an email at the end of it anyway, but here's my personal email as well, if there's any questions around this. Would it be possible, Alicia, for you or Ankit to just share what the mentee responses are? I don't know if you've gotten any yet. Okay, we've gone slightly higher on the optimism, which is excellent. And we're changing as we speak. Okay, super. So this is really interesting, folks. I think the one thought I kind of want to leave you guys with is what we bring to the table as people who are thinking about technology and innovating around technology. In our lifetimes, there may not be a more opportune moment to put our resources together and get that going. So please, no idea is a bad idea. Keep trying. See what is happening around you in the ecosystem. Reach out to us if there's any questions, anything else that we could do to build this conversation. And again, thank you very much for your time. And okay, I think this is where we end the mentee score. I think we're at mostly optimist, still some confusion, still not sure, and anxiety is reduced, which I'm going to take as a win. Super. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for attending the session. And I look forward to the next Sattva Live series. There will be announcements about it on our website as well as on